One sunny afternoon in the fall of 2005, 14-year-old Nina Bellerman returned home from her dance team practice and let herself into her house. She knew her mother, Jackie, was still at work, so she went to the kitchen to look for a note from her. And sure enough, there was a post-it note on the counter. It said that one of her mother's coworkers had called in sick, so Jackie had to cover for them. That meant she'd be working a double shift and wouldn't get home until after Nina had gone to bed. But to make up for it, her mother had prepared one of Nina's favorite dinners that was in the fridge for her to warm up later. Nina was used to this routine and didn't really mind. Her mom managed a local bar in suburban Maryland, which meant she often worked late. So Nina had gotten good at taking care of herself. After finishing up her homework, Nina microwaved the dinner her mother had left for her and ate it while watching TV. After that, she went to take a shower. Standing under the hot water, she massaged shampoo into her hair and relaxed. However, when she reached for the conditioner, Nina noticed a large clump of hair caught between her fingers. She was used to losing hair in the shower, but this was more than normal. She rinsed the hair down the drain and then reached up and began feeling along her scalp to see if there was something wrong with her head. And eventually, her hands touched something very strange. There was this circular, totally bald patch of skin on the right side of the top of her head. Nina was totally shocked. She didn't understand how so much hair could have fallen out all at once. And so as she was grappling with this new information, she sort of leaned forward to let the water rinse off the bald spot. And as she did, another chunk of hair fell onto the ground. Nina practically screamed. She backed away from the water and turned off the shower, and then she looked down and saw the drain was completely clogged with her hair. Nina grabbed a towel and hurried to call her mom. Around noon the next day, Jackie sat beside Nina in the lobby of the pediatrician's office, flipping through a magazine. Nina wore a scarf wrapped around her head to cover up her hair. When Nina had called her the night before, Jackie had assumed her daughter was just being dramatic. But when she finally got home from work that night, Nina was still awake and still in a panic. Jackie couldn't remember the last time she'd seen her daughter this upset. And then when Jackie examined her daughter's scalp, she instantly understood why. The bald spots were disturbing. The areas weren't just patches of thin hair, the areas were completely barren. It was like entire areas of Nina's scalp had just abruptly died. Jackie had never seen anything like it before, so she had told her daughter that the next day they would go see the doctor. When the nurse finally called Nina's name, Jackie and her daughter walked back to an examination room. A few minutes later, the pediatrician arrived, and Nina told him all about losing her hair in the shower. The doctor examined Nina's head, tracing his fingers along the exposed skin of her scalp. And then after he was done, he simply patted Nina on the shoulder and told her not to worry. He said that her hair loss was actually most likely due just to stress. He suggested that Nina might be worrying too much about school or grades or her social life, but if she took it easy and relaxed, her hair would grow back soon and she'd go back to normal. Now, Jackie hadn't noticed Nina seeming particularly stressed lately, but at the same time, she was very relieved to hear a doctor promise that there was nothing medically wrong with her daughter. One winter morning, 3 months later, Nina stood in front of her bathroom mirror styling her hair. She heard her mom calling up from the kitchen to hurry up because they were running late for school, but Nina wasn't ready yet. Despite what the doctor had said, Nina's hair did not grow back. In fact, it continued to fall out. Now she had 7 bald spots across her head. They made her feel so insecure, and so most days she wore hats and scarves to cover her scalp up. However, her friends all noticed and asked her, what's going on? Nina was always too embarrassed to tell them, but at the same time, she was also just plain confused. She didn't know what was going on. She didn't understand it at all. The doctor had told her to just, stress less, but how could she possibly do that when her hair was falling out in high school? After another 20 minutes went by in the bathroom, trying her best, but really failing to arrange her hair to hide the bald spots, Nina finally just lost her patience. Nothing looked right. She couldn't go to school like this. Nina stormed out of the bathroom and told her mom that she needed to go back to the doctor. Jackie put her coffee down and gave her daughter a long hug, and as she did, she told Nina she would set up another appointment with the doctor, and she promised they would figure out how to fix this. Nina was grateful for her mother's support, but at the same time, she felt so impatient and overwhelmed. She had never heard of something like this happening to other kids her age. It just didn't make sense. Making it through high school as a teenage girl was hard enough already, and so adding in losing your hair on top of that was recipe for a disaster. A few days later, Jackie drove home from the doctor's office as Nina sat silently in the passenger seat. This visit had been a huge disappointment. The pediatrician had carefully inspected each of Nina's new bald spots, but once again, he promised there was nothing serious to worry about here, and his advice stayed the same. Nina just needed to stress less. He told Jackie that her daughter's hair loss was simply a side effect of teenage anxieties. When the doctor said this, Jackie had watched Nina's face crumple with frustration. On the drive home, Nina begged her mother to let her drop out of school, but Jackie told her that that really wasn't actually possible. Practically speaking, Nina wasn't old enough to legally stop attending school, no matter the reason. And also, Jackie reminded Nina that her education was more important than anything else, even if she had to suffer through some embarrassing hair loss. As soon as Jackie parked in the driveway, Nina jumped out of the car and ran inside. Jackie followed along after her and found her daughter on the couch with her head in her hands. Jackie sat down next to her and began to rub her back. She swore to Nina that everything would be okay eventually. They had navigated other challenges together, and they'd find a way through this too. But Nina didn't say anything. Instead, she pushed her mother's hand away, stood up, and stormed upstairs to her bedroom, slamming the door behind her. A couple of hours later, in an attempt to brighten her daughter's mood, Jackie ordered dinner from Nina's favorite pizza place. However, when she knocked on Nina's bedroom door with a couple of slices, Nina said she wasn't hungry. She said she was too depressed to eat and just wanted to be left alone. Jackie spent the rest of the night thinking about how she could even help her daughter, but she just felt lost. Nina was more stressed now than Jackie had ever seen her. And so if the doctors were right that her condition was due to stress, well, then it was likely about to get much, much worse. A couple of months later, in January of 2006, Nina was in the school gym stretching before dance practice. She had spent the winter holiday basically avoiding all her friends because still her bald spots had not grown back. She felt helpless and lonely and angry. But now school had started again, so she had no choice but to socialize. The dance team captain began to walk them through their new routine, but as they did, Nina couldn't quite get the hang of it. Her legs felt unsteady, and she kept losing her balance. Then, while trying to do this new high-stepping movement, the right side of Nina's face suddenly rippled with pain. It hit her like an electric shock that was so strong, Nina almost fainted. She walked away from the team as quickly as she could and just said she had to use the bathroom. But in reality, she went and just got her cell phone to call her mom. Her mother was at work, but when she heard her daughter, she said she would get someone to cover for her and she would come pick up Nina right away. An hour later, Nina winced with every step as her mom led her down the hallway of an urgent care clinic. When the doctor entered their exam room, Nina described her symptoms, how she'd started losing hair a few months ago, and now the right side of her face stabbed with pain when she stepped too forcefully. The doctor listened, nodding every once in a while, and then conducted a thorough exam. After 15 minutes, the doctor told Nina that her pain was most likely being triggered by a migraine headache. The bad news was that migraine headaches are notoriously intense, but the good news was that they're also pretty rare and don't last that long, and so he suggested she take some aspirin or ibuprofen to try to reduce the pain. When she got back home, Nina did take a few aspirin. However, that night when she was up in her bedroom, the right side of her face still tingled with pain. A couple of weeks later, Nina was tilted back in a dentist chair with her mouth wide open. The dental technician instructed her to bite down on 2 small flat sensors, and then once she had, they aimed an X-ray machine at each side of her jaw, one after the other. When the dental tech left the room after processing the X-rays, Nina's mom came close and squeezed Nina's hand, and Nina squeezed back. Over the past 2 weeks, the surges of pain in her face had steadily sharpened, and then the previous night during dinner, Nina was struck with a bolt of such intense pain through her face that she could barely open her mouth. It felt like her jaw was wired shut. When Nina described this pain to her mother wondered if maybe Nina's migraines could have triggered some sort of nerve endings in her mouth. and so her mother immediately called the dentist's office emergency line and scheduled an appointment for the next morning. A few minutes later, the dentist walked in and examined Nina's x-rays on a computer monitor. He pointed to Nina's back teeth and said they were compacted and actually crushing one another. The dentist said her teeth were most likely causing all of Nina's symptoms, not migraines. And so even though Nina did not have an explanation for why she was losing her hair, she was grateful to finally have an explanation for her pain. But unfortunately, the dentist said that Nina's teeth could not be fixed until her next growth spurt, which was the optimal time to fix problems like this. At that time, an orthodontist would be able to remove some teeth and size her for braces, which would better align the spacing between her teeth and reduce her pain. The dentist told Nina that, for now, the best thing she could do was just tough it out and be patient. When they left the dentist's office, Nina felt defeated. It was like every time she saw a doctor, they would all tell her the same thing, that somehow if she just waited, magically things would get better. And at the same time, her mom kept promising over and over again that they would find a way through this. But they weren't finding anything, and nothing was getting better. Nina didn't know how much longer she could keep waiting. She felt like she was running out of reasons to even be hopeful. Later that year, around late July of 2006, Nina decided to go through her clothes for the upcoming school year, which was starting in a few weeks. Her last semester of the previous year had been physically and emotionally draining. Her bald spots still hadn't grown back, and her facial pain was constant. And Nina now had alarming new symptoms. She noticed that whatever was happening to her jaw had clearly begun to affect her face, too. Her mouth looked crooked, and the whole right side of her face seemed like it was kind of sunken down. Her mother swore that she was just being hypercritical of her appearance, like most teenagers were, and she promised Nina that to her, she looked as beautiful as ever. But looking in the mirror, she felt anything but beautiful. Over the last few months, her life had been so stressful that Nina really hadn't been eating, and she had lost some weight. And so she knew that was likely going to affect how her clothes fit her. But as she tried on one outfit after another, everything looked enormous on her. And so eventually, Nina went into her bathroom to step on the scale to see just how much weight she had lost. But when she read the number on the scale, she actually at first thought it was an error. She got off the scale and checked the scale's batteries, then got back on again, but the number was the same. Nina had lost more than 30 pounds in the last few months. Nina stepped off the scale and moved over to the full-length mirror to study her reflection, and it was like suddenly she could see how she actually looked. To her, right now, she looked completely gaunt and unhealthy. Her bones poked out of her skin. But that was not the only problem. As she leaned closer to the glass, Nina could clearly see her face had changed even more, and not for the better. The right side of her face looked almost shrunken, like the skin and bones were literally sinking into themselves. Nina was horrified. She thought about going and telling her mother, but her mom looked at her every day without saying a word. And the last time Nina had complained about her appearance, her mom told Nina that she was just overreacting. Now, her mom wasn't being rude about it, but Nina felt like she was being kind of dismissive, and so she didn't want to go through that again. Nina tried to stay calm, but she couldn't stop herself from spiraling into a very dark mood. Her sophomore year started in a matter of weeks, and half her face looked like it was dying. Her hair she could at least try to hide, but not her face. Nina wanted to crawl under her covers and just disappear. A month later, in August, on a rare night off, Jackie was resting on the couch with dinner cooking in the oven when the doorbell rang. She got up and opened the door and welcomed in one of her oldest and dearest friends, Kendra, who was also Nina's godmother. Jackie gave her a big hug and then poured her a glass of wine. Kendra had not been over to visit for a long time, and so there was lots to catch up about. Kendra had begun telling Jackie about her new job when suddenly Kendra froze mid-sentence, and the smile drained from her face. Jackie looked and saw that Nina had just come down the stairs. It was the first time Kendra had seen her in over a year. Nina came in and gave Kendra a big hug too, and Kendra asked Nina how her classes were going and caught up for a minute or two. Then Nina took a plate of dinner back up to her bedroom to eat while she finished her homework. Once Nina's door had shut upstairs, Kendra grabbed Jackie's arm and whispered in a very worried voice that her goddaughter looked emaciated. She barely recognized her, and so she demanded to know what was going on here. For a minute, Jackie assumed Kendra must be exaggerating, but Kendra kept pushing. She insisted that something had to be seriously wrong with Nina. To her, the girl's face was visibly disintegrating. Jackie didn't even know what to say, so she just stood there in silence. And so Kendra said, "Look, go get some old family photos. Let's look at some pictures of Nina from before and compare them to now." Jackie nodded and walked over and grabbed a few boxes of pictures in the hallway closet. Standing at the kitchen counter, Jackie thumbed through the images. And at some point, Kendra picked up a photo of Nina from middle school and she held it up for Jackie. The picture was only a few years old. It was of Nina following a soccer game. She was smiling and sweating and holding a bottle of water. And when Jackie saw it, it was like suddenly seeing what her daughter's smile actually looked like flipped a switch for her. Jackie realized she hadn't seen that smile in a long time. In fact, she recognized now that her daughter's face did look completely different, and not in a good way. Something had changed, but she didn't know when, or more importantly, how. Jackie also felt this sudden stab of shock as this realization sank in. She didn't understand why she hadn't been able to see or accept how dramatically her daughter had changed until right now. But at this point, it didn't matter. All that mattered was it was absolutely clear that something was wrong with Nina. Jackie needed to find someone who could help ASAP. About a month later, in September of 2006, Nina stepped off the school bus in front of her house and promptly went around the side to the backyard and sat alone under a tree. So far, her sophomore year had been even worse than she feared it would be. The kids at school stared and pointed at her. Everywhere she went, she felt like she was getting funny looks. Even her friends began avoiding her because they didn't know what to say to her. Nina heard a rumor going around that she'd been in this bad car accident, and that's why her face looked so messed up. Feeling self-conscious was bad enough, but Nina was also in more pain than ever. Her jaw throbbed with nearly every step she took, and now she also did have a very bad headache basically all the time. However, Nina was still waiting on the go-ahead from her dentist. Nina was so physically uncomfortable all the time that she could barely focus on what her teachers were saying in class. She knew her sophomore year was supposed to be a tough year, but not like this. Nina was miserable. However, one silver lining was that her mother was now completely and totally on her side. Ever since that night Kendra visited, Jackie had taken Nina to every doctor she could find. They'd already visited 5 different specialists so far. Unfortunately, so far, those appointments had accomplished nothing. None of these specialists knew what was going on with her. They didn't even have a theory. They admitted that her face was developing in a pretty irregular way, but they didn't know why or when the sunkenness and drooping would stop. After the most recent doctor's visit, Nina had had a meltdown. She felt broken. It was like she'd been cursed, and there was nothing anybody could do to reverse it. Nina sat in silence under the tree for a few more minutes until she heard the sound of her mother's car pull into the driveway, and then a moment later, she heard the sound of the back door swing open. Her mother walked out to the tree and sat down beside her, at which point Nina simply put her head on her mom's shoulder and began to cry. A couple of minutes later, after Nina had stopped crying, she sat up and told her mother that she had made an important decision, and she really wanted her support, not an argument. She said that she needed to drop out of school. She just simply couldn't take it anymore. The mockery and the constant humiliation at school was so overwhelming, and the nonstop pain in her body just made her life constantly miserable. Also, her social life basically didn't exist anymore. And in terms of being able to do the schoolwork, well, she couldn't even think straight or pay attention in class. She said at least if she was at home, she could suffer privately and with some dignity. She knew this was a big ask because education was a huge deal to her mother. But Nina promised that she would register to take the GED, which is the equivalent of getting a high school diploma, the moment she was qualified. For a minute, Jackie didn't say anything. She just sat there in silence, holding her daughter's hands. Then she finally looked up at Nina and simply nodded. She said she understood and that she was proud of Nina for being so brave. She saw how much she was hurting. Nina immediately felt relieved, but also felt a fresh throb of pain in her jaw. Her life and her body were falling apart, but at least it wouldn't be happening in front of her entire high school anymore. 3 weeks later, Nina sat with her mother in the examination room of an oral surgeon named Dr. Greg Gibson. Nina had low expectations, but her mom convinced her that Dr. Gibson might at least have a suggestion on how to reduce Nina's jaw pain. Nina had gone back to see her regular dentist, but he would discover that her problem was even worse than the dentist had imagined. Nina's teeth were pushing into each other and her jaw so sharply, he said that Nina actually needed oral surgery right now. There wasn't time to wait for the perfect moment. So he'd referred Nina to come see Dr. Gibson, who could make a more accurate diagnosis. A few minutes later, Dr. Gibson entered and introduced himself. Then he took a seat beside Nina and her mom and swiveled a computer monitor so they could both see the screen. Then Dr. Gibson clicked open a folder of dental x-rays that his assistant had taken a half hour ago. Dr. Gibson scrolled through the images until he got to one that showed the right side of Nina's mouth. He moved his cursor along the top and bottom rows of teeth, which visibly looked like they were buckling into one another. Dr. Gibson told Nina that, unfortunately, she would need oral surgery, major oral surgery. The teeth on the right side of her mouth had been significantly damaged by the way they were pushing against one another. Nina was disappointed, but not overly surprised. She knew her teeth were compacted already, and they were getting worse. She'd also felt the inside of her mouth changing over the past year, but hadn't known what to do about it. As Dr. Gibson clicked through the rest of the images, it was odd that the x-rays clearly showed the left side of Nina's mouth seemed totally different. The teeth there seemed to be growing fairly straight and normal. Then, Dr. Gibson clicked open a composite image of Nina's whole head, and her head looked visibly lopsided, sort of shriveled on the right and normal on the left. Nina watched Dr. Gibson for a reaction, but he didn't look surprised. Instead, he had this look come over him like he suddenly understood something, and he turned to Nina and her mother and he said, "I think I just figured out what your diagnosis is." Dr. Gibson correctly diagnosed Nina with a condition called Perry-Romberg syndrome. Its signature symptom is the gradual degeneration of half of a person's face. The disease is quite rare. Perhaps just a few thousand people in the entire United States have this condition. But the true frequency of this disease is not known, because doctors so often misdiagnose it. The clue that sort of put it all together for Dr. Gibson was Nina's dental x-rays. The fact that the majority of the damage to her teeth and jaw occurred on the right half of Nina's face was a clear red flag. But his suspicions were confirmed by Nina's bald spots, which corresponded with her impacted teeth. Most of Nina's bald spots were clustered on the right side of her head, where all the teeth were crushed together. With Perry-Romberg syndrome, damaged nerve endings prevent proper blood flow to one side of the patient's head, which causes the muscle and tissues there to slowly die. Nina's scalp was the first area to decay, so that's why her hair began to fall out. Next, when the bones in the right side of her jaw stopped growing, her teeth started buckling inwards. Gradually, this started impacting other nerves in Nina's face, causing endless stabs of pain for the teenager. Eventually, the entire right half of Nina's face began to shrivel and cave in. Unfortunately, there is no cure or treatment for Perry-Romberg syndrome. Typically, the condition stops on its own around the time patients reach their late 20s, but doctors still don't know why this is. And so, until her late 20s, all Nina could do was try to manage her pain with a regimen of prescribed medications, try to be patient, and just wait for the syndrome to run its course. When Mary Kelly was still just a little girl, her two older sisters nicknamed her Mary Sunshine. This is because every morning, as soon as the girls would wake up, Mary would leap out of bed and run around her house, pushing aside all the curtains, so every room in the Burley, Idaho home filled with sunshine. The nickname stuck because it not only captured her cute morning routine, but it also captured her sense of optimism, energy, and radiance that people associated with her for her entire life. When Mary was born on October 11th, 1921, Burley was just a small rural town in southern Idaho with a population of just over 5,000 people. Most of its residents, the Kelly family included, were farmers, and the main crops grown in the town were grains, sugar beets, potatoes, and alfalfa. Like her older brother and two older sisters, Mary loved living on her family's farm. The kids held barnyard rodeos, they had potato fights every fall after the harvest was done, and during the hot summers, they cooled off in the irrigation canal near their house. Mary's parents were devout Mormons, and this religion would always be central to Mary's life. Members of the Mormon Church, called the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or LDS for short, believe their church is actually the original Christian church started by Jesus Christ and brought back or restored in 1830 by LDS church founder Joseph Smith Jr. The teachings of the church, which center around the teachings of Jesus Christ, were all written down by Joseph Smith Jr. in a book titled The Book of Mormon. Despite Mormons being known for living very modest and reserved lives, for example, they don't drink alcohol, they avoid caffeine and tobacco, still, Mary's childhood home was a very fun, raucous place filled with music and stories. Mary was the daughter of a big, charismatic Irish father and a tiny English mother who sang duets together at church. Mary inherited her mother's quick wit, her sparkling blue-green eyes, and her curly hair, but she had her father's sense of humor. Her father also taught her at an early age how to dance and how to yodel. When Mary was 13 years old, a new family named the Campbells arrived in the neighboring town of Unity and joined the same LDS church in Burley that the Kellys attended. Among the Campbells' 13 children was a handsome 16-year-old son named Curtis. He was dark-haired and serious with a flair for math, electronics, and engineering. By the time Mary was 16 and Curtis was 19, they had fallen in love. And the next year, in 1938, the two of them got married. Over the next 14 years, Curtis and Mary moved more than 6 times. They bounced from Utah to Idaho and then back to Utah. Then they made their way to Los Angeles, California, and Nevada, and wherever they lived, Mary was that mom who was full of energy, fun, and who loved a practical joke. At each new town, every kid in the neighborhood quickly learned that if you gave Mary a garden hose, you were sure to get soaked. And if she was inside washing dishes, you still weren't safe because she'd just open the kitchen window and soak you with the sink hose attachment. And no matter where they found themselves, Mary always made sure her family attended an LDS church, and that the family was always involved in the church's education and activities. But for all her good nature and sense of fun, Mary was not a pushover. Once, when her car stalled out right in front of a green light, the vehicle behind her started honking their horn. Unable to get her car going, Mary casually hopped out of her car and walked back to the car behind her, and she knocked on the driver's window, and when the incredulous man rolled down his window to see what she wanted, she said to him in a very sweet voice, "Mister, if you'll go up there and start my car for me, I'll sit back here and honk your horn for you." The driver went from angry to smiling and laughing, and then got out of his car and he walked up to Mary's car and proceeded to fix her engine for her. During those first 14 years of marriage, Curtis would serve in World War II as an aviation technician for the Navy. Mary would give birth to 4 sons and 2 daughters. However, 2 of the boys died shortly after they were born. Despite the heartbreak of losing those 2 children, the economic and political upheaval of a war that redefined the United States as the world's superpower, and the disruption of constantly moving and Curtis constantly changing jobs, Mary and Curtis still had a very strong and happy marriage. When Curtis walked through the door after work, his children knew their parents would always take a few minutes alone with each other to hold hands and talk about their day. In 1952, just ahead of their 15th wedding anniversary, the Campbells' good life got even better when Curtis landed a top-paying job as an engineer with Boeing Aircraft Company in Seattle, Washington. The work, developing the technology that would later be used to design drones for the U.S. military, was more exciting and challenging than anything else Curtis had ever done. The Campbells bought their first house, a 3-bedroom bungalow just outside of Seattle. It had 3 bedrooms and a pastel-colored double porcelain sink in the narrow kitchen right under a window that overlooked the backyard. And so Mary loved to fire her sink hose out of that window to soak her kids and her kids' unsuspecting friends. When the kids had had enough of Mary's big practical joke, there were also empty lots on either side of this house where the kids had plenty of room to play and ride their bikes. Both Mary and Curtis were active in the local LDS church in their town of White Center, and within a year of their arrival there, Curtis became an ordained Mormon bishop and the leader of the ward where the Campbells attended church. 3 years later, in 1956, Mary and Curtis welcomed their 5th child, a little boy who was immediately nicknamed Kelly after his mother's maiden name. Mary felt truly blessed. She was busy working in the church she loved, and she was busy raising her 5 beautiful children. But 2 years later, the Campbells' 20-year-long marriage fell apart. As bishop, Curtis had lots of one-on-one interactions with members of his ward. Often they involved counseling people about their marriages and relationships, as well as giving spiritual guidance. And in late 1957, Curtis began an adulterous affair with a young and strikingly beautiful young woman named Janice, who had come to him for advice about her marriage. Even after church elders stripped Curtis of his bishopship, Mary continued to defend him against accusations and rumors of infidelity. But in 1958, when Boeing reassigned Curtis to McGuire Air Force Base in Trenton, New Jersey, Mary had no choice but to face the terrible truth. Curtis told his wife he did not want her to go with him to New Jersey. Instead, it would be his lover, Janice, who eventually followed Curtis to the East Coast. Mary and her kids were devastated. The perfect life they thought they had was now ruined. Mary packed up her family and moved back to Utah, where her family was, to regroup. In letters to her sister, it was clear that Mary had made up her mind that she'd rather, quote, paddle her boat alone than accept anything less than a committed and faithful marriage. But that didn't mean Mary was opposed to the idea of reconciliation with Curtis. And it didn't take Curtis very long to see the damage he had done to himself and his family. Shortly after she moved to New Jersey with him, Janice left Curtis and went back to her parents' home in Utah, and so Curtis, now all alone, fell into a deep depression. Despite feeling betrayed and hurt by him, Mary was very worried about Curtis. So after nearly a year of being separated, when Curtis began to reach out to Mary and tell her how much he missed their life together, Mary was open to moving with the kids to New Jersey to be with him again. And in the spring of 1959, the Campbell family was reunited. And 1 year later, when Boeing sent Curtis from New Jersey back to Seattle, Mary would bring with them a sixth child, a baby boy, and Curtis would buy Mary her dream home, a big 2-story farmhouse 20 miles south of Seattle. The white wood-sided house had a covered wraparound porch, a big kitchen, and a side entrance. The long gravel driveway was lined with trees and lilac bushes, which Mary loved. Most of the nearby properties were lettuce farms, and in the spring, the dark, damp fields would be covered in green. The local schools were good, and there was plenty of room for the children to play. And right after they had unpacked in their new home, Mary got deeply involved in LDS church activities. Over the next 2 years, she became the head of her local ward's relief committee. She was also a member of the Church Building Fund Committee, and she was active in Primary, the LDS program that offered religious instruction to kids aged 3 to 12. But Mary had changed. The separation and Curtis's infidelity had taken some of the light out of her nature. It had also made her very sympathetic to the plight of divorced or single women. So in 1960, a year after they were back in Seattle in a little town called Kent, when the ward bishop asked Mary and Curtis to help counsel and support a young single mother who had just joined their ward and didn't know anyone, Mary was very quick to say yes. 26-year-old Thelma Ann Swenson was grateful for Mary and Curtis's help. 10 years earlier, she had moved to Utah from her hometown in England and married a Mormon from Salt Lake City. When the marriage broke down, she moved to Kent in Washington with her 3 young children, but she was just barely scraping by financially. Mary immediately hired Thelma to take care of her 4-year-old son and new baby. Mary would often drop them off at Thelma's trailer home after Mary dropped her 3 older children off at school. This arrangement allowed Thelma to get a much-needed paycheck, and it gave Mary more time to spend on church activities when her older kids were at school. As Thelma and Mary became friends, Thelma opened up to Mary and Curtis about problems she was having with her estranged husband. And when Thelma showed up one evening at their house with a bruise on her face, she told them that the injury was the result of her estranged husband hitting her. The Campbells were horrified and urged Thelma to contact them anytime she ever needed anything or anytime she ever felt like she was in danger. From that point on, Mary always made sure to invite Thelma and her kids to every holiday dinner just so that they wouldn't be alone a couple times a year. On the morning of Wednesday, March 8th, 1961, so roughly 1 year after Mary and her family had moved back to Seattle to the town of Kent, Mary was up early as usual, cooking breakfast for her kids and making bologna sandwiches for their bagged lunches. It was a cool 51 degrees Fahrenheit outside and very cloudy. When Mary looked out the window, she was just happy to see that at least it wasn't raining. By 8:30 a.m., Mary had all the kids packed into the family's Plymouth station wagon. The first real baby car seats wouldn't be invented until the next year, so Mary just made sure the kids used their seatbelts, and she settled the baby, Russell, in the front passenger seat. Just before 9 a.m., she dropped her 3 older children, Scott and Janelle and Patty, off at school. She told her older daughter, 11-year-old Janelle, that Thelma would be picking up the girls after school and taking them to primary, their after-school church instruction program, but that she, their mom, would come get Janelle and Patty after primary and bring them home for dinner. Scott was 13 years old, which meant he didn't go to primary anymore as the age cutoff was 12, and at the age of 13, his parents had allowed him to begin walking home after school on his own. After smiling and telling her son she would see him after school, Mary looked behind her and checked that her 4-year-old Kelly was still belted in the back seat, and then she turned to the front seat to make sure her 7-month-old baby, Russell, was still secured in that seat. Then Mary looked one more time at her older kids as they walked into the school building, and then she pulled away from the curb out of the parking lot and headed for her church, where she had 2 meetings that day. Shortly after walking into the LDS church, Mary turned and saw Thelma walk through the front door as well with her own young kids. Thelma shook off the hood of her coat and ran her fingers through her short dark curls that were damp with Seattle's constant mist. She'd once told Mary that she thought she'd left all the rain and clouds behind her when she moved away from England, a place notorious for its wet weather. When Thelma looked around and saw Mary, she smiled and walked over. The 2 women chatted for a few minutes, Thelma confirming that she was all set to take Mary's 4-year-old son Kelly home with her that afternoon for a playdate. By the time Mary's second church meeting ended at noon, Mary was very thankful for Thelma's help. By that point, Mary's baby, Russell, had started to get restless and fussy, and so Mary was eager to get back to her home and put him down for a nap, and then maybe she'd have a little time to herself. It was about 12:30 in the afternoon when Mary drove up the long gravel drive to her house, parked the car in the detached garage, and let herself into her house through the side door, which led directly into the kitchen. Talking quietly to baby Russell, she walked without stopping through the kitchen and down the hallway past the door to the combination powder room and bathroom and into the dining room. Once there, she put down her purse on the dining room table and settled Russell into a small crib they had in the dining room. She gave him a kiss, then covered him with a thick cotton blanket. Still dressed in her coat, Mary decided to stop at the powder room to freshen up before going back to the kitchen. And so she turned around and began walking back down the hallway that she had just come in on, and then about halfway down, she turned left to go into the powder room bathroom. But as soon as she turned, she stopped right in the doorway, and then she screamed, because a man she had never seen before in her life was standing right in front of her in the powder room bathroom. Paralyzed with shock, Mary just stood there as the man suddenly lunged out with his left hand and grabbed her and knocked her to the ground. Mary fell hard onto the hallway floor, but before she could even move, the man was on top of her with one of his knees pressing into her stomach and the other knee across her neck and jaw. Her scream was now muffled, and she saw the man raise his right arm above her head. She felt another wave of panic rush through her as she realized in his right hand was a length of metal pipe. But instead of striking her with the pipe, the man, while holding that pipe high over his head, told Mary to stop screaming. Instantly, Mary did as she was told. And then, lying there perfectly still under the crushing weight of her attacker, Mary felt a sudden calm wash over her. She nodded her head reassuringly, and the man slowly rose to his feet. Then the man reached down with his left hand to help Mary stand up. As she got to her feet, Mary noticed immediately that this man also had a gun in his front pocket. Then, as soon as Mary was on her feet, she did what she had done her whole life. She called on her faith and looked at the man in front of her not as a monster, but as a human being. She took a moment to compose herself, pulling the skirt of her dress down and pushing back the hair that had come out of its clips. She straightened her glasses, she took a deep breath, and then she looked up at the man who was now just standing there awkwardly with his arms and his metal pipe down by his sides. She had never seen this person before. He was young, in his early 20s, with shaggy hair that fell across his pale, soft face, and he was huge. Not only tall, but very big and heavy. Mary let out a deep breath and then said, "What do you want?" The man seemed eerily calm. He told her that he was there because he needed money. The only cash Mary had was in her wallet, which was in the dining room. She told the man as much as she headed past him down the hall in that direction. The man followed behind her and then stood without saying anything while she opened her purse, took out her wallet, and then laid the 3 $1 bills that were inside along with some change on the dining room table. She also pulled out her credit cards and driver's license, laying them on the table as well, and then she also just said to the man, anything of value in this house, it's yours. Even though this man had said he wanted money, the only item that he was interested in was her driver's license. He reached out and grabbed it, looking carefully at the typewritten name, then turning to her with his first question. "Are you Mary Campbell?" Mary nodded. "Yes, I am." And then, as this was happening, the thing Mary was most worried about happened. In the crib, just a few feet away from them, Russell started crying. Mary silently prayed that the man would not hurt her child, and he didn't. As he stood there, still staring at her license, he casually told her to go take care of her baby. Feeling an enormous sense of relief, Mary turned away from the man and stepped quickly to the crib. She reached down and picked the baby up and rocked him for a second, all the while glancing across the room at the man who had just put her license back on the table and was now emptying out the other contents of her purse onto the table. Mary changed Russell's diaper, and then she laid him carefully back down in his crib. Then, Mary told the stranger very gently that her baby was going to keep crying if she didn't feed him, and so she really needed to go into the kitchen and make Russell a bottle. While that might have been true, in reality, all Mary was thinking about in that moment was just getting this intruder away from her baby. So she asked the man if he would like to join her in the kitchen as she makes the bottle, and maybe she could fix him something to eat as well. The man agreed, and the two walked down the hallway to the kitchen. Mary first, the man after her. While Mary prepared the bottle of milk, the man stood quietly in the middle of the kitchen without saying a word. After the bottle was ready, Mary walked past the man, who stayed put, and she went back down the hallway all the way to the dining room, where she fed Russell as quickly as she could. All the while, the man just stayed in the kitchen, standing there watching Mary down this hallway. After giving her baby a kiss on the forehead, Mary tucked him back into his crib and returned to the kitchen where the stranger was. Mary was too nervous to sit down, so she went to the refrigerator and took out the hamburger meat that she was planning to serve that night for her family's dinner. She unwrapped it and asked the stranger if she could make a hamburger for him. When he said no in a very polite tone, Mary couldn't help but feel sort of relieved. After that initial attack, the man had not threatened her in any way, and now he was just standing there quietly in her kitchen and being very polite about it. Mary took a few more quick glances at him and noticed that despite him being this really big person, he looked more like a child than a man. In fact, he couldn't be much older than her oldest child, Dell, a 19-year-old young man who had left home just 2 years earlier to join the Navy. As soon as she thought of her son, Dell, Mary felt even better. And slowly, her fear started to give way to her usual curiosity about people and her conviction that even the most flawed human beings could be helped and ultimately redeemed. So after her visitor very kindly refused the offer of a hamburger, Mary poured them both glasses of cold milk and set out a plate of the cookies she had made the night before. She sat down in one of the chairs that was nearest the sink at the kitchen table, and then she nodded to the chair opposite her on the other side of the table, and she asked the man if he would like to please sit down with her. The man seemed to like this idea, so he walked over and sat down. He also carefully laid the metal pipe he was carrying on the empty chair next to him. Once they were both seated at the kitchen table, Mary reached for a cookie and took a bite, and then pushed the plate in his direction. As he took a cookie off the plate, Mary asked him, why had he tried to rob her? The man explained that for the last 6 months he had not been able to find any work, and he and his wife desperately needed money so they could buy food and take care of their 2-year-old son. Mary listened, already turning ideas over in her head about how she might be able to help this young family like she and her husband had been helping Thelma. When there was an opening in the discussion, Mary gently encouraged the stranger not to rob her, that was the easy way out and something he would likely regret. She then told him he should consider opening himself up to prayer and also to asking for help and guidance. They chatted for a few more minutes over the milk and cookies. Then suddenly, the man asked Mary if she would like to go upstairs with him and see what he had done to her house. She couldn't tell if he was proud of what he did or if he felt bad and just wanted to show her. Clearly, there was something off about this man, but he didn't seem like he wanted to hurt her, and she didn't want to make him angry again, so she said, okay. And together they headed up the stairs. Right away, she could see that the bedrooms and the hall closet and study had been ransacked. Articles of clothing had been pulled out of drawers and tossed on top of the floor. The man apologized for the mess, saying he had tried to make it look like a burglary had happened. When Mary knelt down in front of the bureau in the master bedroom to start refolding the clothes back into the drawers, the man also bent down and started to help her. Once they had put everything back in place in the master bedroom, the man stood up and then took the gun out of his front hip pocket. It was Curtis's gun. Clearly, he had found it and stolen it. The man looked at the weapon for a moment as if he was seeing it for the first time. Then he sighed and looked at Mary and said, "I guess I won't be needing this anymore." And then he walked over to Curtis's bedside bureau and put the gun back in the top drawer where he had found it. After this, Mary and the stranger left that room and headed for the study next door. Inside, Mary picked up some of the loose papers on the ground, and as she did, she very gently told the man who was standing next to her that she needed to take these papers down to the kitchen, and, maybe it was time for him to be on his way anyhow. The man nodded, and the two headed back downstairs. Once inside the kitchen again, Mary put the papers on the kitchen counter and then turned to face the man who was once again standing awkwardly in the middle of the room. Mary smiled at him and thanked him for helping her clean up the upstairs, and she also told him that he had not done any real damage, so she had no plans to tell anyone or call the police or say anything. She also told him that he was free to take the cash in the dining room on his way out. Then she stepped forward toward the table, and as casually as she could, she picked up the length of metal pipe from the kitchen chair and bent down and placed it under the table out of reach. The man watched her do this. Then, after a pause, he asked if she might be able to give him a ride away from her house. Mary sat down on one of the chairs for a moment, just wishing now that this man would leave. She took a deep breath, and then she looked up at the man who had now moved to the side door of the kitchen that opened into the side and backyard. Mary looked at him and said, "No, I can't give you a ride." Then Mary stood up and walked over to the door with him and pointed through the window on the door to an outside white gate on the edge of their property. And she told him that if he went through that gate and crossed a wooden plank that led over a stream and into the woods, that no one would see him leaving. The man stared at Mary for a few seconds, and then he thanked her for the milk and cookies, and then he looked down kind of sheepishly and said he was sorry that he had hurt her, and then he turned and reached for the doorknob. Mary felt a flood of relief wash over her. She immediately began running over the crazy story she would tell Curtis that night when he came home and they sat together on the couch in the living room talking about their day. Later that same afternoon, Thelma arrived at the schoolyard to pick up Mary's daughters, Janelle and Patty. Scott, happy he had aged out of primary religious education classes, had already started the walk home to his family's farmhouse. There was barely enough room in Thelma's old car for the two girls. They had to squeeze in alongside their little brother Kelly, as well as Thelma's kids who were ages 7, 5, and 3. Janelle was annoyed when Thelma said that she would be back in about an hour or so to pick them up, not their mother. Apparently their mom had called Thelma to arrange a last-second swap because their mom was tied up with something. Janelle didn't care about the last-second swap or getting a ride with Thelma. She just hated how crowded it was in Thelma's old car and didn't want to have to get back in. But Janelle just shrugged and hopped out of the car and began steering the younger children towards the door of the church. Sure enough, about an hour later at 5 p.m., Thelma was waiting outside for the kids, and all 6 of them piled into her tiny car. But instead of Thelma turning south towards their farmhouse, Thelma drove north. When Janelle asked where they were going, Thelma told the kids they were going to her house to meet up with their older brother Scott and Bishop Owen, who was the LDS bishop for their ward. Janelle shrugged again. She had no idea why her brother was at Thelma's, but she didn't care about that. Mostly, she was just feeling irritated as she jostled with her 9-year-old sister Patty for a little more elbow room. As they pulled into the drive leading up to Thelma's small, shabby 2-story rental house, Thelma parked next to Bishop Owen's car and then opened the heavy back door of the car to let all the kids out. When they walked through the front door into the small living room, they saw Bishop Owen sitting on the couch holding 7-month-old Russell. In a nearby chair, they saw their brother, Scott, who was watching TV. But he looked like he was staring right through the TV, like he was totally zoned out. Before the children could even say hello, Thelma had shooed Janelle and her sister Patty outside to play with Kelly and Thelma's 3 children. About an hour and a half later, around 7 p.m., the kids were still outside and it was getting dark and chilly when Patty complained that she needed to use the bathroom. Janelle walked to the back door of the house only to find it locked. Cold, tired, and hungry, Janelle was certain this locked door was the work of her annoying 13-year-old brother Scott, and she immediately started rattling the doorknob and yelling for him to come and unlock the door and let them in, or she was going to tell their mother. But when she and the other kids heard the bolt pull back, it wasn't Scott standing in front of them, it was Bishop Owen. He stepped aside and all the kids streamed in. Patty headed for the bathroom, while Janelle went straight to the living room to glare at her brother. But when she finally planted herself directly in front of the TV he was watching, she saw right away that something was very, very off about him. Before she could ask him what was wrong, through the window she caught sight of something moving outside. When she turned to look, she saw her father's car pull up next to Thelma's car, and behind her father's car, she saw 2 police cars, the single-dome lights on the roof of each one flashing bright red. Several hours earlier, Mary's son, Scott, left Meridian Junior High School just ahead of his sisters and began the walk home. The walk took about 30 minutes, and at 4 p.m., Scott turned off the main street and started walking down his family's long driveway. As he passed by the detached garage, he noticed his mother's station wagon was gone. Scott thought to himself, if his mom and baby brother were not home, maybe he could just go inside, drop his things off, and then head right back out again and go see his friend, Larry Smith, who lived in the house next door. When Scott walked into his own house through the front door, he reflexively called out for his mother, but there was no answer. However, when he passed through the living room into the dining room, he saw his mother's purse laying on the dining room table with her driver's license and credit cards spilled out next to it. Then he noticed his mother's coat hanging over the end of the baby's crib, and perhaps most surprising, he saw his 7-month-old brother, Russell, in the crib fast asleep. If Russell was here, then his mother surely had to be here too, which was strange since he hadn't seen her car. But regardless, he moved towards the bottom of the stairs and called out again for his mother, but still, there was no answer. The big house was totally quiet. Scott put down his things on the dining room table and headed down the hallway for the kitchen. On the way, he glanced into the powder room, but no one was inside. When he reached the end of the hallway and looked into the kitchen for the first time, he froze. What he saw inside of it was so terrible, he couldn't even begin to process it. There, on the floor, was his mother. Under her head was a red velvet cushion taken from the living room couch. Blood had gushed out of her mouth and formed a huge puddle under her head. There were dark bruises like a collar around her throat. Her blood-soaked, dark red hair looked black. Her eyes were wide open and staring, and her glasses were on the floor next to her. Scott started backing away. He knew without being told that his mother was dead. Then he turned, stumbled, and ran down the hallway, back through the dining room, past his brother, and out the front door. Once outside, he ran along the pathway behind his house to his friend Larry's house. Bursting through their back door, Scott found Larry's mother and frantically explained what he had just seen in the kitchen. As Mrs. Smith picked up the phone to call police, Scott suddenly remembered that he had left his brother, Russell, in the house. Ignoring Mrs. Smith's questions, Scott ran back to his own farmhouse and into the dining room where he saw his brother still laying in his crib fast asleep. He carefully lifted Russell out of his little bed and then sat down on the living room couch, holding the baby until police and the local doctor arrived. When police did arrive, they led Scott, who was still holding his brother, back to the Smith's house next door, where Scott called his father at Boeing. After he was off the phone, one of the police officers asked Scott a few more questions about what he had seen. Then the officer drove Scott and Russell over to Thelma's house, where Bishop Owen was waiting for them. When Scott stepped inside of Thelma's house, Bishop Owen took the baby from Scott's arms and began rocking him, and then he settled Scott into a chair and turned on the TV. Scott said nothing. He just sat there staring at the TV with no expression at all on his face. Back at the Campbell's farmhouse, the doctor confirmed that Mary was dead. She had been strangled and hit on the head 3 times. And when the doctor picked up the pillow that was underneath her head, he noticed a small hole in the pillow with singed edges in the fabric and realized someone had clearly fired a gun into this pillow, and when they examined Mary's head again, they noticed there was a gunshot in her left temple.
and so they had placed the pillow over her head, fired that shot into her temple, and then afterwards they had placed the pillow under her head, and that was how she was found. Even before police began collecting evidence, they were totally puzzled by what they saw inside the house. With credit cards left on the dining room table, it did not look like a robbery, and if the attacker was looking for valuables, why did they only pull the clothes out of the drawers in the children's rooms upstairs and not go through the neatly folded items in the closed drawers in the master bedroom where Mary and Curtis slept? And who had been sitting at the kitchen table eating milk and cookies? When Curtis arrived, the police refused to let him into his own house. Dazed and shocked, Curtis just asked, "Where's my wife's car?" And immediately, when police saw it was gone from the garage, they sent out a description of the car over the police radio in case the killer had used it to escape. A few minutes later, Curtis was back in his car heading to Thelma's house. 2 police cars followed him with their lights flashing red. As Curtis stepped into Thelma's house, his daughter, Janelle, looked from him back at her brother, who she could now tell was crying. Curtis walked to the couch and sat down. He motioned for Janelle and Patty and Kelly to sit down with him. Then he looked at the scared little faces all turned in his direction, and he said, "Your mother is dead. Someone killed her." Curtis was quickly removed from the list of possible suspects. Dozens of people could confirm that he had been at work that day during the window of time when Mary was killed, sometime between 12:30 p.m. when she arrived home from her church meetings and 2:30 p.m. By 8 p.m. on the night of the murder, police had located the Campbell station wagon in the parking lot of the Group Health Hospital in the town of Renton, 3 miles away. There were no weapons or blood in the car. All it told police was that the murderer must have gotten a ride to the Campbell's house and then used the station wagon to make their getaway. Once Curtis was allowed back into his house later that night with his children, he went upstairs to check for his gun in his drawer and found it was missing. He told the police about it, and they asked him what kind of gun it was and what caliber it was. When he told them, they realized it was the same as the gun that had been used to shoot Mary in the head. Even though there were almost 100 law enforcement personnel working the murder case, by Friday, March 10th, so 2 days into the investigation, the best lead police had was still just a report from the Campbell's neighbor. The neighbor told police that at about 9:30 a.m. on the day Mary was murdered, she had seen a big man with shaggy hair almost down to his shoulders walking first across the Campbell's front yard and then later that day across their backyard. On that Friday, police got an anonymous tip over the phone that would eventually lead to the break they were looking for. The police were told to check out Art Ferguson, the husband of one of the members of Mary Campbell's church. He matched the description of who the neighbor had seen, and he had recently just gotten a haircut. 21 years old and weighing 220 pounds, Art, along with his 20-year-old wife, Virginia, actually did not have very much information to offer police when they were questioned. While Art did not know the Campbells, his wife Virginia did, and she was totally traumatized by the murder. Between sobs, Virginia kept going over and over what little she knew about Mary's movements the morning of Mary's murder. She'd seen Mary at church, and she'd heard Mary and Thelma making plans for a playdate. She'd even visited Thelma after church and seen Mary's son, Kelly, out playing in Thelma's backyard. But after Virginia's visit with Thelma, Art and Virginia had not been in Kent. They had spent the afternoon driving 60 miles to eastern Washington to see if Art could find work at 2 local mills out there. The reason Art had a haircut was because Virginia had insisted that he had to get one. She thought he wasn't getting hired because he looked sloppy. But the next day, Saturday, 3 days after the murder, police got a call from Art's father. He told them that they better get out to his place. There was something his son needed to tell them. Once police arrived, they found Art sitting at his father's table, head in his hands. He didn't waste any time telling police what had been weighing so heavily on his mind for the last 3 days. Art told them in a calm voice that he had killed Mary Campbell. Police immediately arrested Art and took him into the police station, and there he spent most of the next day answering questions about his crime. He seemed to have remembered every detail of what happened. The following is based on Art's statement to police. On Wednesday, March 8th, so the day Mary was killed, Art said he walked up the driveway of Mary's farmhouse at about 9:30 a.m. In his pocket was a length of metal pipe. When he reached the house, he let himself in through the kitchen and went upstairs and began ransacking the rooms so that when police investigated the murder he intended to commit, it would look like Mary had been killed by a burglar. When Art found Curtis's gun in the master bedroom, he stuck it into his front pocket along with some ammunition. Then he went back downstairs and hid in the combination powder and bathroom off of the downstairs hallway to wait for Mary to come home from her church meetings. Mary came home and Art attacked her as planned, but right away there was just something about Mary. Her charm totally disarmed him, and instead of killing her, he quickly found himself sitting in the kitchen eating cookies and drinking milk with her. When Art got to the part of the story where Mary had told him how to leave his house without being seen and how she would not call the police, Art paused. He told police at that point he had decided he was not going to kill Mary after all. She was just too nice and had been so kind to him. He told police he remembered turning and grabbing the doorknob and getting ready to walk out that side door. He said he even remembered the sound of Mary's voice behind him as she said goodbye to him. But the next thing Art knew, he had turned around and lunged at Mary, squeezing her neck as tightly as he could. According to his formal police statement, as he choked her, Mary, who was totally surprised, stumbled backward a few steps, and both he and Mary slid down the front of the stove to the ground. Art said, quote, "She tugged at my shirt front very lightly, and once at my hair, and tugged very lightly at my sleeve." Art said when his hands got tired and Mary's head fell forward, he released her neck, letting her fall all the way to the ground. Then he turned on his knees and grabbed the metal pipe Mary had shoved under the kitchen table. Art stood up, and with the pipe in his right hand, he swung it down hard at Mary's skull. He hit her 3 times until blood began to flow out of her mouth. Then he ran upstairs to get Curtis's gun that he had put back earlier when he and Mary were up there. On his way back to the kitchen, he picked up a red velvet pillow from the living room couch. When he knelt down beside Mary, who was now motionless, he put the pillow against her left temple, he pressed Curtis's gun into the pillow, and then fired a single shot. Then he laid Mary down on the floor of her kitchen, resting her head on top of the soft, round, and now blood-soaked pillow. Before leaving the house, Art dumped out the rest of the contents of Mary's purse on the dining room table, pocketing the $3 and change, and then he took her car keys. Art stepped out of the farmhouse and entered the Campbell's detached garage. He got into Mary's station wagon and then laid the pipe, the gun, the gloves he was wearing, and his jacket on the seat next to him. Then he turned Mary's car on and drove down the driveway out onto the main road. On his way to the hospital parking lot in Renton, where Art would leave the car and drive home in his own vehicle that was parked there, he stopped along an empty stretch of road near the Puget Sound, and he threw the gun and pipe out into the woods. Art's story explained every strange circumstance about the crime scene that had left police baffled, from the milk and cookies left on the table, to the ransacked bedrooms, to the baby sleeping unharmed in his little bed. But what it didn't explain was why Art had killed this mother of 6, who he didn't even know. Art's bizarre answer to that question would lead the police to another person, the person police would accuse of being the real mastermind behind this murder. On March 8, 1961, the morning of the murder, while Mary was busy dropping her kids off at school and then heading for her church meetings, Art was waiting next to his car in the parking lot of the hospital in Renton, about 3 miles away from Mary's farmhouse. At exactly the agreed-upon time, an older model car pulled up next to him and idled for a minute as Art opened the passenger door and climbed inside. The driver of the car asked Art if he was ready to go and whether he needed to take one more look at the map. Days earlier, the driver had made a hand-drawn map showing a detailed layout of the Campbell's farmhouse. Art had been told to memorize it, along with the usual route that Mary Campbell took through her house when she came home with her baby. Art was feeling nervous and thought looking at the map again might calm him down. The driver handed him the piece of folded paper. As Art sat there studying it, he tried to use the memorization technique the driver had taught him that would apparently sear the image into his mind. Meanwhile, the driver put the car in gear and pressed the gas pedal. On the way to the Campbell's farmhouse, the driver stopped and bought 2 gallons of gas at a gas station and paid by check. When they arrived near the entrance to the Campbells' long gravel driveway, the driver took back the hand-drawn map. They made sure Art had his piece of metal pipe inside of his jacket pocket, and that Art knew exactly where to find Curtis Campbell's loaded pistol. The driver also told Art to be sure he used a pillow from the couch to silence the sound of the shot that Art would eventually fire directly into Mary's temple. Art nodded. Just before he climbed out of the car, a pink and black truck passed by them on the main road. Art's driver only watched Art for a few seconds as he walked up the driveway toward the farmhouse. Then the driver checked their watch and turned the car around and pulled back onto the road and started heading for their next stop. About 3 hours later, at 12:30 p.m., when Art ambushed Mary inside of her house, Art's driver was standing in a different house in front of a kitchen clock, watching the minute hand with intense concentration. The person standing next to the driver would later tell police she could make out the words the driver was speaking as they stared at the clock. "Do it, do it, do it," they said. An hour later, the driver again looked at the clock. This time, the driver, aka the real mastermind behind the murder of Mary Campbell, smiled and then ran her fingers through her short, dark curls and looked out the window at Mary's son, Kelly, playing in her yard. Then, Thelma Swenson, the hard luck case that Mary and Curtis had tried so hard to help, the babysitter who had once lived with them and who knew exactly where Curtis's loaded gun was and what Mary's everyday routines were when she got home from church or from running errands, turned to her good friend, Art's young wife, Virginia, and hugged her. And then, according to Virginia, Thelma swayed slowly side to side while holding on to Virginia and said, "I know where Art is. He's up there right now butchering Mary Campbell." When Art confessed to the murder of Mary Campbell, he told police that he was only acting on the orders of Thelma Swenson. He said she planned every detail of the attack. Art, who was mentally challenged and highly suggestible, claimed that he had been manipulated by Thelma into believing Mary Campbell was an evil person. In terms of getting him to commit the actual crime, Art said Thelma had used hypnosis. And when police checked local town library records, they would see that Thelma had checked out several books on mesmerism. Art accused Thelma of basically putting him into a trance and then literally walking him through every step he followed once he was inside of Mary's house. Police would later find a copy of that hand-drawn map of the Campbell's farmhouse in Thelma's house. The gas station attendant who took Thelma's $2 check on the morning of the murder, and later the driver of that pink and black truck that had passed by, would both confirm that they saw Art in Thelma's car the morning of the murder. According to Art's wife, Virginia, Thelma had drawn her into the plot as well. Virginia told police that Thelma had met with both her and Art and asked them how they would go about killing someone and not getting caught. It was through these conversations she was having with Art and with Virginia that Thelma began to put together a plan to murder Mary Campbell. Virginia claimed that Thelma had even made her and Art rehearse how Art might strangle Mary using a length of electrical cord, with Virginia playing the part of the victim. But after Art had actually attacked Mary in her home, he told police that he genuinely had decided he was not going to kill Mary after all. It was like he had come out of his trance and he saw her for the person she really was, this really wonderful person. But, he said, after he turned to actually leave the house, he fell back under Thelma's control again. And then the next thing he knew, he was standing there in the kitchen with his hands around Mary's neck. It would turn out Thelma had a history of psychiatric problems and had been hospitalized twice. Once following a diagnosis of schizophrenia, a mental illness that can cause episodes of psychosis, delusions, and paranoia. Her estranged husband, who had never physically abused Thelma, would also testify that she was a pathological liar. According to Art and Virginia, far from being grateful to Mary for her help and support, Thelma had developed a deep hatred of Mary. She blamed Mary for the breakup of Thelma's own marriage, which didn't really make any sense, but she did, and even claimed that her estranged husband was the father of Mary's 7-month-old baby, even though the baby had been born in New Jersey before the Campbells had even met Thelma. Police also investigated the possibility that Thelma was becoming obsessed with Curtis and saw Mary as an obstacle to Thelma pursuing that relationship. For his part, Curtis had already begun to suspect that Thelma was mentally unstable and that she was using makeup to fake the bruises that she claimed were the result of her estranged husband's physical abuse. For these reasons, in the weeks leading up to Mary's murder, Curtis had told Mary that they really should break off their friendship and involvement with Thelma. However, Mary wouldn't hear of it. She believed Thelma needed them and Mary did not want to abandon her. On September 23, 1961, just 6 months after Mary's murder, both Art Ferguson and Thelma Swenson were found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. But that was not the end of this murder case. 2 years later, on June 6, 1963, the Washington Supreme Court overturned the conviction against Thelma and ordered a new trial for her. 5 months later, a new jury would acquit Thelma of all charges. While the court denied Thelma's request for custody of her 3 children, Thelma would go on to marry again and have a second set of 3 children before divorcing her second husband and taking those 3 children with her. In her memoir about her mother's death, titled The Multiple Murders of Mary Kelly Campbell, Janelle Campbell writes that as of 2021, Thelma Swenson was still alive. Out of deference to Thelma's family, the author does not include any details about Thelma Swenson's current life or location.
On February 27, 2025, a man in his 30s named John grabbed a drink out of his fridge in his kitchen and then walked into his living room. He had just finished work, and his wife and kids were out visiting his in-laws, and so tonight he was excited to just sit on the couch and watch TV. As he sat down, he called out to his dog. There was a huge thunderstorm outside, and he knew his dog was deathly afraid of thunder, and so he expected her to come running as soon as she heard her name. But after he called her, he heard nothing. But this didn't worry him, because he figured, his dog must have found a good hiding spot and had just fallen asleep there. So John turned his attention to the TV and began looking for a horror movie to watch. But as he did, he started thinking about his wife and his kids driving home that night, and he was worried about them, because of the weather. So instead of clicking on a horror movie, he turned to the local news to check on the weather. However, as soon as the local news came on, it was not the weather they were talking about, despite this being a major storm. This should have kind of dominated the news, but it wasn't. Instead, there was a much bigger story on the news right now, and that was there was this huge riot happening at a state prison that was only 10 miles away from where John lived, and apparently the most dangerous convict at this prison had escaped. The newscasters began to describe this convict, and they said he actually had a nickname the other prisoners had given him. They called him the Monster of Cell Block C. Now, this nickname had to do in part with the fact that he was just a horrible criminal, like people were scared of him. And then also, the nickname came from his just totally bizarre and threatening behavior. He would routinely sit in the corner of his cell and eat insects off the ground. And then also, he kept jumping on prison guards every chance he got, which got him thrown in solitary confinement, where he just continued to eat the insects there and act totally unhinged. But perhaps the biggest reason he was dubbed the Monster of Cell Block C is because of his appearance. He had these crazy bulging eyes and this really thick neck. It made him look totally deformed. The anchors were telling locals to stay vigilant because the police had no idea where the Monster of Cell Block C was. Maybe he was still at the prison, but it did seem entirely possible that he really had escaped. And then it seemed like the anchors were about to put a picture up of the actual inmate himself, when suddenly John heard this huge boom of thunder outside, and then the power in his house just completely cut out, so the TV shut off. He didn't get to see what the inmate looked like. John instinctively reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone to use the flashlight feature, but his phone was dead. It had died like a couple minutes earlier, and he had told himself, I gotta plug this phone in, but he just hadn't done it yet, and now the power's out. So he has no light source. And on top of that, John couldn't help but feel sort of rattled. He had just heard on the news that, the Monster of Cell Block C has escaped 10 miles away, and now the power's out at his house in the middle of a storm, and he's all alone. But at the same time, John told himself, everything's fine. It's just a coincidence here that the power's gone out right at this moment. I'm fine. The state prison, it's 10 miles away. And why would this convict have any interest coming to my house? So I'm fine. And so John stood up and began heading towards his kitchen where he knew he kept a flashlight. But as he got close to the kitchen, he heard a strange sound. It was an electronic ding, like a phone notification sound. But at the same time, John really couldn't quite place it.
And he also knew it couldn't be his phone because his phone was dead. However, he thought maybe it's my kids' iPads. After all, the sound he was hearing, the more he listened, he could tell it was coming from upstairs, and that's where his kids' iPads were. However, the sound still seemed really weird to John because it started suddenly, basically right after the power went out. He hadn't heard it before that. And also, if these were, notification sounds on his kids' iPads, you would think there would only be maybe 1 or 2 notifications. You wouldn't have, a string of notification sounds. But as John listened, he heard like this incessant amount of dinging coming from the upstairs. And it wasn't constant. It was sort of sporadic, like random dings kind of all over the place. But then John remembered that his kids' iPads had a messaging app on it so they could talk to their parents. And John remembered that, his phone is dead, his wife could be out there driving in the storm, and so maybe she was trying to get in touch with him, couldn't because his phone was dead, and so now she was trying to message him using their kids' iPads. And so suddenly his heart rate began to pick up, he ran into the kitchen, he grabbed the flashlight, turned it on, and he ran to the base of the stairs that led up to the second floor. And as he began ascending the stairs, he's hearing that dinging sound over and over and over again. He knows it's from somewhere upstairs, and he can't help but feel totally anxious about it, like he can't place it. It kind of sounds like an iPad, but at the same time, it doesn't. He doesn't really know what it is. And so up the stairs he goes, he's scanning all around. There's no movement in the house. He still hasn't seen his dog. He gets to the top of the stairs, and in their house, there was this hallway that ran right and left from the top of the stairs. John looked to the right and shined his flashlight down there, and it was just all darkness and totally silent. The dinging was coming from the left side of the hallway. John swung the flashlight around and he shined it, and as soon as he looked down the hallway to the left side, his heart really began to race. Because remember, the power is off inside of his house, so all the lights and everything should be off. But as he was looking down the hallway, he saw there was bright light coming out from underneath his closed bedroom door. And also, that dinging sound was coming from in his bedroom. And his kids' iPads were not in there. At this point, John was terrified, but he knew he had to go in there. He had to see what was going on inside of his house. And so, very nervously, he began walking down the hallway towards the closed door. And as he's walking, the dinging sound is getting louder and louder. And with each ding from inside of his room, that light that was on inside of there would sort of pulsate. And you could see the light pulsating from underneath the door. And so John is getting more and more nervous as he's getting closer and closer to this door. And then right as he's about to touch the door and actually go inside, he hears a new sound. And it's coming from behind him. In fact, it's coming from downstairs. It was like this thumping sound, like something thick and meaty was like hitting the wooden floors over and over again. John's first thought was, maybe he left a window open downstairs and that was just the sound of the rain coming in. But as he's listening to this thumping sound that's getting louder and closer to him, making its way towards the stairs, he's thinking, that can't possibly be the rain. That does not make any sense. So he thought, oh, it's gotta be my dog. And so he called out to his dog again, this time much more urgently. Frankly, he wanted the comfort at this point, but the dog didn't come. And that thumping sound continued, and it began to go up the stairs. At this point, John knew he needs to go over and see who is now coming up the stairs. He has to go look. But he's paralyzed with fear. He's in the middle of this huge storm, the power's out, he has no idea what's going on with his wife and his kids, there's this escaped convict down the road, he has all these strange noises in his house, and so he just stands there completely unsure what to do. And then finally, as this thumping sound is right about to crest the stairs and be in the hallway, whatever or whoever it was, John turned and just threw open his door, figuring, you know what, at least if I go in my bedroom, I can shut the door and create space between me and whoever this is. But the second he charged into his bedroom, holding the flashlight over his head like a baseball bat, to confront whatever was in there, he just froze because what he saw in front of him was horrifying. To understand what John saw and why it was so bad, you have to know that overall, John was a pretty nice guy. He was a good father, a good husband, he gave to charity, he took in stray animals. He was the kind of guy who would, if you drop money out on the street, he'd pick it up and give it back to you. He's a good guy. But there was one aspect of his life where John wasn't so nice. In fact, you could make the case that he was sort of a monster himself. John, in one very specific way, was sort of a bully. Every day for the last 5 years, John had been personally bullying and torturing this one victim online, and then also riling up other people to do the same thing. And so on this night, when he flew into his bedroom to escape whatever else was going on in his house, what he saw in his bedroom that was so awful was his victim. And he knew for sure that his victim was here for revenge. John's victim turned attacker was standing right there in the middle of his bedroom, clutching John's dog in their fist, like they were about to squeeze the life out of her. And at the same time, the loud thumping sound that John had run away from into this room that was coming up the stairs, well, John heard it thump against the door to the bedroom. And so John realized that must be another attacker. There's two of them, and now I'm gonna die. And so instinctively, John whipped around and just stared at this door, getting ready for whoever this was to enter the room. And as the door began to swing open, John closed his eyes and put his hands up around his head, bracing for impact. And he's standing there literally waiting to die, but nothing happens. And after a few seconds, John, he opens his eyes and he looks around and he smiles. It would turn out the monster of Cell Block C really had escaped from that state prison during that riot. And after they got out, they went to John's house. But the monster of Cell Block C was not a dangerous, horrible criminal, at least not to John. In fact, the monster of Cell Block C was one of John's oldest friends, and he had broken out of prison for one reason: to save John and his dog. Immediately after entering the bedroom, the monster of Cell Block C leapt onto the attacker who was holding John's dog hostage and managed to free the dog. The dog ran to safety, and then the monster of Cell Block C basically wrestled the attacker onto the ground and restrained them. And as they did this, John, who's sort of standing off to the side, is so relieved, but also he was suddenly inspired. And he had this idea that not only would defeat his attacker for good, but also would keep his friend, the monster of Cell Block C, from going back to prison. John turned and ran out of the bedroom and went into one of his kids' rooms where he grabbed a frog stuffed animal. He ripped the head off, and then he went back into his own bedroom and superglued the frog head onto the top of his attacker. John's attacker, the one he had bullied for so many years, who had come back for revenge, who was in his bedroom emitting pulsing lights and making dinging sounds and grabbed John's dog by their fist and held them hostage, was none other than the like button. John was actually John Allen, aka me, Mr. Ballin. And with that frog head superglued on top of the like button, now they looked a whole lot like the monster of Cell Block C, which of course was my best friend, Seagull Lung. And so when the police showed up a short time later, they carted away the like button because they looked like the monster of Cell Block C. To this day, the like button is still serving out old Lungy's prison sentence. And as for old Seagull Lung, he's somewhere on a beach in Mexico. And now that this story is over, I can finally say, April Fools.
In the late summer of 1930, Rafael Pansardi and his wife Leonarda Cianciulli moved with their 4 young kids to a little town in northern Italy called Correggio. A terrible earthquake had destroyed the family's previous village and killed nearly all of their neighbors. And so this family was feeling very lucky to be alive, but when they arrived in Correggio, they really had nothing and were hoping that, the people of this town will just be very welcoming and generous and kind of help them get set up again. And the people of this town did exactly that. Correggio was this beautiful place inside of a fertile valley where people lived in these cottages surrounded by rice fields and mulberry trees. And the people who lived there were very tight-knit and looked after each other and cooked for each other and had parties together. I mean, this was a real community. And so when Raphael and Leonarda arrived, the townspeople immediately found them this cute little cottage by a stream with a whitewashed front door and a beautiful stone hearth for cooking, and there was an attached storefront on this cottage that they were giving them. And then on top of that, once the family had moved in, the family's new neighbors helped get Raphael a job, and they also helped Leonarda set up the attached storefront that was part of their cottage so she could sell her homemade soap bars out of this shop. And so very quickly, the family just completely fell in love with Correggio, especially 36-year-old Leonarda. Losing her home and her previous neighbors in that terrible earthquake had been a tragedy on epic scale, But it was far from the first tragedy that Leonarda had been forced to live through. Leonarda had been born into poverty. Her mother had actually come from a very wealthy family, but they had cut Leonarda's mom off when she became pregnant with Leonarda. And so when Leonarda's mom gave birth to her, she blamed Leonarda for their poverty and all of their problems, and so beat her relentlessly. And then on top of that, Leonarda's father died when she was very young, and so she was stuck at home being abused constantly by her mother. When Leonarda was 21, she met Raphael and fell in love with him, and he was a very kind and gentle man. He really made a very strong first impression on anyone who met him. But when Leonarda went to her mother and introduced Raphael to her and said, "I'm going to marry this man, I love him," her mother flew into a rage and then literally cursed Leonarda. She actually out loud muttered the spell and then told Leonarda that because of the spell, Leonarda would have evil following her forever. Now, of course, Leonarda was very used to her mother's terrible behavior, and so she did not actually think she was at risk of this curse affecting her life in any way. But not long after actually marrying Raphael, Leonarda began to see evidence that this curse might actually be real. It started with Leonarda having these sudden fits of seizures for no particular reason, and then Leonarda, every time she got pregnant, she would miscarry and lose the baby. And so feeling really sad and desperate because all she wanted was a family, Leonarda actually went to a fortune teller in hopes that they would tell her that in the future, her life got better, not worse, which to Leonarda meant, the curse was not real if my life improves. But after this fortune teller took Leonarda's hands and studied her palms, she looked up at Leonarda and gave her grave news. She said, "Leonarda, you're going to have living children, but they're all going to die young. And I see a prison and an insane asylum in your future." This experience totally shocked Leonarda and confirmed for her that her mother's curse must be real. And sure enough, over the following years, Leonarda and Raphael would go on to have 14 living children, and 10 of them would die when they were babies or toddlers. And so by the time Leonarda had arrived in Correggio with her family in 1930, she was absolutely petrified that her last 4 precious children would die because of this curse. And so in order to keep her kids safe, she basically never let them out of her sight, and then she also made sure they always adhered to these strange rules and beliefs that Leonarda had come up with about good and evil that were designed to somehow protect the kids from this curse. But the incredible show of generosity and support and kindness that Leonarda and her family had experienced when they arrived in Correggio had really done something to Leonarda. In fact, it really kind of changed the way she viewed the world. Suddenly, she was less concerned with this curse and how to protect her family from it, and instead, she was just kind of content. She felt safe. She felt happy. The women in the town loved Leonarda and always came by the house to say hi to her and eat some of the amazing tea cakes that she would make. And also, Leonarda had become best friends with this woman named Virginia, who was a former opera singer from Milan, who was very elegant and beautiful. And every time she went to a dinner party, she would invite Leonarda. And also, Leonarda and her family were becoming financially stable really for the first time ever. Leonarda's soap shop that she ran out of their cottage was really successful. People came from all around to buy her soaps because nobody could make them like she could. And Raphael's job as a clerk was very steady, and he too was becoming well respected in town. And so because of how well this transition to Correggio had been, at some point Leonarda made a promise both to herself and to the universe that instead of focusing all of her time and energy on this curse, which had plagued her whole life, instead she was going to focus on helping the people of Correggio any way she could because they had done so much for her. And that is exactly what Leonarda did, but in a kind of ironic way. Because of the fear Leonarda had for her mother's curse, she had gone to that fortune teller many years ago. And even though the news she got when she saw the fortune teller was horrible, Leonarda had left that experience kind of fascinated with the art of fortune telling and magic and sorcery. It just really appealed to her. And so now that Leonarda was running this very successful soap shop out of her house, there were all these people coming from far and wide that would ask to barter for her soaps. Bartering is like trading one item for another item versus paying for something outright with money. And so Leonarda began bartering with these travelers whenever they had books about fortune telling, about magic, about sorcery, about how to make potions, about the occult. And after reading through all of these books and learning as much as she could, Leonarda, in addition to selling her soaps, began offering fortune telling services to the people of Correggio. And it would turn out she was really good at predicting the future, to the point where people in town basically began going to her for all kinds of advice. She helped women find love, she told farmers what crops to plant, she created these charm bags for people and told them they would protect them. She also began creating these herb potions for people when they got sick. It actually got to the point where people trusted her so much that when they got sick, they didn't even go to the doctor, they just went to her. And so very quickly, Leonarda felt very proud of the fact that she had lived up to the promise she had made both to herself and to the universe to always help the people of Correggio at every turn. But more than that, Leonarda was starting to think that this newfound sense of purpose and happiness she was getting in helping the people of Correggio through her various services had finally broken her mother's curse. By 1939, Leonarda and her family had been living in Correggio very happily for almost 10 years, and at the time, Leonarda's oldest son, Giuseppe, was 17 years old. Giuseppe was tall, he was handsome, he had dark hair, he had dark eyes, and all the girls loved him. And Giuseppe and Leonarda had always had a very close relationship. Every day, Giuseppe would come home, and he and his mom would sit in the kitchen, and they would chat for a while and eat some of her tea cakes. But now, in 1939, when Giuseppe was 17, he started to act a little bit different. He would come home, and instead of going into the kitchen to sit with Leonarda, he would just go straight to his room and shut the door. And when Leonarda or Raphael would ask him, hey, is everything okay? Giuseppe would get very defensive and say he was fine and to please just leave me alone. But to Leonarda, it seemed really obvious that her son was not fine, and she thought, maybe he has some sort of secret he's keeping, and that's what's making him act this way. He's hurting on the inside, but he can't share it with the world. But Leonarda had no idea what this secret might be. And then one day, late that same year, Leonarda was walking through town when one of her neighbors came up to her and said, "Hey, are you aware that your son Giuseppe has signed up for the military and he's leaving for training in just a few months?" Leonarda had not heard about this. People were talking a lot about World War II, which had just started around this time, but Leonarda had never considered that her precious son would go off to fight in that war. But now, Leonarda realized that Giuseppe's recent strange behavior suddenly made sense. This was the secret he was keeping. He had joined the military, and he hadn't told his family. Leonarda turned around and went straight home. She went right into her bedroom, shut the door, and she just sobbed. To her, it felt like her mother's curse was back, and now her precious son was going to go off into the war, and he was going to die. Unless she found a way to combat this evil that was now following her again. So, for the next several days, Leonarda did not open up her soap shop, she didn't come downstairs, she just stayed locked in her bedroom and read through all of her books about magic and sorcery and the occult, looking for some sort of solution for how to fight this curse. And finally, she figured out what she had to do. She read that if she gave something beautiful to the universe would reward her. And in Leonarda's mind, that reward would be sparing her son. And so Leonarda decided that the most beautiful thing she could offer the universe would be to help the people of Correggio, which she was already doing, but in her mind, she thought she could really ramp up her efforts and really try to change people's lives. And she thought if she could do that, the universe was sure to notice and it would save her son's life. Leonarda decided that the first person she would really go above and beyond to help inside of Correggio was a woman named Faustina. Faustina, who was in her 70s, was desperate to get married, but to many people in town, including Leonarda, she seemed kind of beyond help. She was totally antisocial, she was awkward, and just kind of given her age, it seemed like marriage was just not in the cards for her. But this is where Leonarda thought she could step in and change everything for Faustina. She would find her a husband. So Leonarda reached out to Faustina and told her about a friend of hers, a man, who lived in a city to the north, who was also alone in his old age and who was likely looking for marriage, and she could set them up if Faustina was interested. And so Faustina was immediately interested and wanted to meet this guy, but Leonarda did tell her that, this guy, the reason he's not married is he's kind of difficult to be around, he's kind of a jerk, but he's got a wonderful heart, he means well, I think he'd be a great fit for you. And so again, Faustina's like, great, I want to meet him, I want to marry him, I'm ready. And then finally, the day came when Faustina actually went to this other town and met this guy in person, and they fell in love. And Faustina just moved right in with him, and before long, she was sending happy postcards back to Correggio, telling everyone about how happy she was and how thankful she was for Leonarda's help in setting them up. And so Leonarda was obviously thrilled not only for her friend's happiness, but also it really felt like she had checked the box in terms of really going above and beyond to help someone in Correggio in an effort to get the universe to spare her son. But her son was still a couple months away from leaving for training, and Leonarda, she's very superstitious, and she's thinking, okay, I don't know if that was enough to get the universe to save my son. And so I need to find somebody else I can help. So in September of 1940, Leonarda began her next good deed project with another woman in town. She was a widow in her 50s named Francesca. She had worked as a teacher, but when her husband got sick, she quit her job, and then when her husband ultimately died, she was left with nothing. So Leonarda reached out to Francesca and told her that she, Leonarda, would be willing to reach out to her own mother's rich family to see if maybe they had a job they could finesse for Francesca. Now, of course, Leonarda was not excited about talking to her mother's family, who had disowned her mother and had shown no interest in Leonarda. But Leonarda wanted to do this for Francesca and for the sake of her son and getting the universe to notice what she was doing. And so sure enough, Leonarda would reach out to her mother's family, and they were remarkably open to the idea, and they got a job for Francesca in Switzerland. And so eventually, Francesca jetted off to Switzerland, and then a couple of days later, she was sending postcards back to Correggio, saying how happy she was and how thankful she was for Leonarda's help. And so again, Leonarda was so happy about this outcome, both because she cared about Francesca, and also because this was yet another kind of check in the box of her good deeds that the universe was going to notice that in turn would save her son. But again, after Francesca didn't need any more help, Leonarda found herself looking at her son, who was getting closer and closer to leaving for training, and she would think to herself, have I done enough to protect him? Have I really stopped this curse from killing him after he leaves? And Leonarda eventually decided that no, she had not done enough. She needed to do at least one more really big good deed for someone in this town. And who better to help than her best friend, Virginia, the former opera singer? Leonarda knew from all her talks with Virginia that Virginia really missed living in the big city and going to the opera house. And so Leonarda reached out to Virginia and said, you know what? I can reach out to my mother's rich family and maybe they can find a job for you in a big city if you're interested. And so Virginia was like, wow, yes, I would love that. That's an amazing opportunity. And so Leonarda again would contact her mother's rich family, and again, they came through, finding this job as a social planner for this very rich guy in Florence, Italy, who often funded plays and operas. And so this job was perfect for Virginia. When Leonarda told Virginia about this opportunity, Virginia cried tears of joy. After packing up all of her things, Virginia made a stop at Leonarda's house to say goodbye and thank you, and the two women would hug and laugh and cry, they would drink wine together, And then finally, when it was time for Virginia to go, even though Leonarda was very sad, she was also quite happy because finally she felt like this good deed was enough to get the universe to spare her son. However, Leonarda, being a very superstitious person, did have one more little thing she wanted to do with Giuseppe before he left for the military. And this little thing was her, Leonarda, bathing her son, her 18-year-old son, with a particular bar of soap, and then she also wanted to feed him a special kind of tea cake that she was going to make. The soap and the tea cake had these special herbs and ingredients and different things she had pulled from her books of magic and the occult, and they would kind of form like a protective barrier both outside and inside of Giuseppe. So, on the same night that Virginia headed off to Florence, when Giuseppe came home, Leonarda approached him and said, "I want to give you this bath and I want to feed you these tea cakes." And Giuseppe was not remotely enthused at the idea of having his mom bathe him. He's 18. But he knew she was highly superstitious, she seemed pretty emotional about this, and it just seemed like it was extremely important to her. And so he said, okay. And so Leonarda washed her son with this special kind of magic soap, and then she also gave him the tea cakes. And then afterward, even though Giuseppe was really annoyed by what he had just been asked to do, Leonarda was so happy she was practically floating. She felt like she had done everything she could possibly do, and now she could just relax because her son was safe. But soon, Leonarda would learn that that was not actually true. A few days after giving her son the magical last bath and magical tea cakes, the police showed up at the front door of Leonarda's house. And when she opened the door and saw the police, she asked what was going on, and the police would say to her, "Hey, the 3 women that you supposedly helped that left town recently, they've all been reported missing by their families. They don't know where they are." And so Leonarda, she was totally shocked by this, and she said, "No, that's not possible. I write to them all the time. I get postcards that come in very regularly from all of them." And then Leonarda went and got the postcards and showed the police, like, "Look, I'm talking to them. How could they possibly be missing?" And so the police, they would look at these letters and they would agree with Leonarda that it is pretty strange that she'd be getting these very authentic seeming letters from these women if these women were also missing. And so eventually the police would leave and they would tell Leonarda that they would be in touch if they needed anything. And then over the next couple of days, Leonarda was very concerned about these 3 women, but she received numerous postcards from these women over those several days, and all of these postcards were totally normal seeming. And so Leonarda was fairly confident that whatever was going on with the police had to have been a mix-up, and she wouldn't be hearing from them again. But a couple of weeks later, the police did come back to Leonarda's house, except this time they didn't knock, they just barged right in. After the police had spoken with Leonarda that first time, they did some digging on these letters that she was receiving, and they managed to trace them all back to their start point. And it turned out all of these letters from all 3 of these women were originating from one place. It was this little town to the north of Correggio. And when police went to this little town, they discovered that these letters that were starting in this little town were all being mailed by the same person. And they got a physical description of this person who apparently was pretending to be these 3 women. And the description was of a tall, handsome young man with dark hair and dark eyes. It was Giuseppe. After the police barged into Leonarda's house, they went straight to Giuseppe's room where they accused him of murdering those 3 women, and then they hauled him out of the house and brought him to the station to question him about where he dumped the bodies. When the last police officer left Leonarda's house, Leonarda walked outside and just stood there wondering what she was going to do. It was like she had done everything in her power to protect her son from this curse, but somehow this curse she knew had done this to her son. And so now she knew there was only one thing she could do. Without saying anything to her husband, she went inside, she got her things, and she began making her way to the police station. At this point in her life, Leonarda looked much older than her actual age of 46. She had very gray hair, her face was very wrinkled, and she was stooped over, and she was always carrying these charm bags and magical potions and little stick figures that she claimed protected her family. And so her overall appearance when she wandered into the police station was that of a very frail old woman who was also very strange. And so Leonarda hobbled her way up to the front desk, and in a trembling voice, she asked the attendant if she could speak to the detective who was working on her son's case. And then a moment later, she was led into an interview room where she was told to wait. And then a little while later, the lead detective walked into the room. He sat down across the table from Leonarda, and he said, "What can I do for you?" And immediately, Leonarda said, "My son, Giuseppe, is innocent." And the detective, when he heard this, he was not remotely surprised. In fact, this is fully what he expected this conversation was going to be. He knew Leonarda loved her son very much, and of course she was going to say he was innocent. This is what parents typically did in cases like this. But the detective decided he wouldn't try to stop her. He would just let this very distraught mother kind of talk for a bit. He would tell her that he would follow up on whatever she was saying, and then he would drive her back home. But this detective was not expecting the things that would come out of Leonarda's mouth over the next couple of hours. In fact, her story about why Giuseppe was innocent was so shocking and so bizarre that the detective outright said, "I don't believe you. I don't believe this. This can't be true." And then other officers were called in to listen to her story to see if they believed it. And they too said, "This doesn't seem real." But the police would follow up on the details she gave, and it all checked out. It would turn out, back in late 1939, on the day that Faustina, the first woman that Leonarda pledged to help in order to get the universe to save her son, when Faustina was set to go north and meet her future husband, Faustina stopped by Leonarda's house to say bye. And when she was in Leonarda's house, something very unexpected happened. When Faustina walked into Leonarda's kitchen where Leonarda was, Faustina was so excited about meeting her potential future husband that her hands were shaking and she was smiling ear to ear. And so Leonarda said to Faustina, "Hey, you need to calm down." And so she handed Faustina a glass of wine. And so Faustina took the wine and she had a couple of sips of wine. And right away, Faustina started feeling dizzy. And before long, she was grabbing the table just to keep from falling over. It would turn out the wine was poisoned by Leonarda. And so Faustina, she's kind of looking up at Leonarda, and Leonarda is looking down at her, and she's got an axe in one of her hands. And she says to Faustina, "I'm so sorry." And then she winds up and she strikes Faustina in the chest with the axe and lodges it in her chest. And so she lets go of it, expecting Faustina to die. She doesn't. Faustina's just standing there with an axe in her chest. And so Leonarda grabbed the handle of the axe, she pulled it out of her chest, and then began wailing on her head over and over and over again until Faustina did fall to the ground dead. Then Leonarda lit a fire under her big metal pot on the stove, and then she cut Faustina's body into 9 pieces, she drained the blood out of the body into a bucket, and then she chucked those 9 pieces into the pot on the stove and began to mix them with caustic soda, which is a powerful dissolving agent that's used to make soap. And then she boiled the ingredients, her body parts and this caustic soda, for hours. Faustina's body slowly turned into this horrible black mush inside of this pot, and Leonarda was watching this the whole time, and she just had a look of total disappointment as this was happening. And then at some point, she just took the pot off the stove and dumped the ingredients, Faustina's body, down the septic tank. And then Leonarda waited for Faustina's blood that she had dumped out to coagulate, which means it became semi-solid. And then she heated it up in the oven and then ground it into flour. And she would use that flour to make tea cakes, which she fed to her friends the next day, as well as her son, Giuseppe. Leonarda also asked her son to mail some letters for her from the little town to the north where Faustina had supposedly gone. These letters, of course, were written by Leonarda pretending to be Faustina to give the impression that she was still alive and well. And Giuseppe, when he was told to go mail these letters, didn't think anything of it. He was used to doing errands for his mom. Even though Leonarda basically got away with killing Faustina, her plan for Faustina had not really gone the way Leonarda had hoped. When she boiled Faustina's chopped up body parts and this caustic soda, they didn't really mix the way she wanted them to. Leonarda was convinced that the reason for this is because Faustina was too skinny, and so there wasn't enough fat on her body for the mix to be perfect. So Leonarda had come up with another elaborate story, this time for another woman, Francesca, about that job in Switzerland she got through her mother's rich family. Of course, none of that was true, and when Francesca came by Leonarda's house to say goodbye to her, she was offered a glass of poisoned wine, and after she sipped from it, she became dizzy, and then Leonarda showed up with an axe and hacked Francesca to death. But again, when the body parts and the caustic soda were in the pot on the stove boiling together, they were still not coming together the way Leonarda wanted. And so again, Leonarda, with a look of disgust, just dumped the pot down the septic tank and wound up making tea cakes from Francesca's blood. Then the next day, she fed those tea cakes to her friends, as well as Giuseppe, and she also asked Giuseppe to send a few more letters from up north. These letters were, of course, from Francesca. Still feeling totally unsatisfied with how the last two killings had gone, Leonarda moved on to her third target, her best friend, Virginia. And this time, when Virginia came by Leonarda's house to say goodbye, everything went to plan. Leonarda was able to poison Virginia, she killed her with the axe, she chopped her up, she put her in the pot, and this time, the 9 chunks of her body mixed beautifully with the caustic soda. And so after adding a few fine perfumes into the pot, Leonarda was finally able to create the thing that she had not been able to create with the other 2 women's bodies. And that was a beautiful, rich, creamy bar of soap. She also, again, made tea cakes from Virginia's blood. That night, when Giuseppe came home, Leonarda demanded that she be allowed to bathe him with her magic soap, i.e. the soap made from Virginia's body. And so she did that. She scrubbed him with Virginia's body soap. And then while she was doing that, she fed him the tea cakes that were made from Virginia's blood. It would turn out Leonarda did in fact believe that in order to save her son from this curse, she would need to give something beautiful to the universe. And at first, she really had believed that the way to do that was by helping the people of Correggio above and beyond anything she had ever done before. But at some point during her interactions with Faustina, the first woman, Leonarda had decided that, you know what, that wasn't enough. She really needed to make sure that her son was going to be safe. And so the only way really that Leonarda could guarantee her son would be safe would be if she actually took a life and gave that back to the universe. That would save her son. The reason Leonarda wound up taking 3 lives and not just 1 life is because she also decided that as an extra protective measure, she wanted to make sure that she actually bathed her son, literally, in the body parts and kind of essence of the life she had taken. And so that's where the idea of the soap came in. However, the first 2 women, their body parts didn't mix right, and so she couldn't turn them into soap. But then Virginia came along, and her body did mix with the caustic soda, and so Leonarda was able to make her soap. She was able to bathe her son with Virginia's body and feed him Virginia's blood. And so in Leonarda's mind, she had done everything she could to protect her son at that point. Leonarda would ultimately be sentenced to 30 years in prison, as well as 3 years in an insane asylum, just as the fortune teller had predicted. Leonarda died in 1970 when she was 76 years old. As for her family, they fled Correggio, and 3 of her children changed their names and vanished. And her prized son, Giuseppe, who she had killed to protect, had gone on to join the military, and he would go to war, and he either was killed in combat or simply changed his name and vanished as well.
With Lungy now safe on a beach and the like button serving Lungy's prison sentence, I think it's safe to say that if you come after one of us, you face the wrath of both of us. So I have one thing to say to the like button, and that's, don't touch my frog. And so to celebrate that sentiment, and to celebrate April Fool's Day, we have an exclusive and limited merch drop. We have this sweet graphic t-shirt that's sort of a reimagining of one of all of our favorite movies. I'm sure you can see the inspiration. And on the front, it says, John Ballen, don't touch my frog, okay? Pretty cool. There's also a poster as well with the same graphic. All you have to do is head on over to shopmrballen.com to get yourself a piece of this sweet merch drop. Again, that's shop